Okay, guys. So let's get started. Today we're going to start looking at the various age groups in American society. If you've been starting your outlines for Chapter 12, you know that when we look at age, obviously there's numerical age, but there's also age in terms of groups, and a lot of times your numerical age means different things in different societies, or even in different time periods. So a lot of what this unit looks at has to do with these various like life stages and kind of how their age has shifted over time, and then also some of the issues that each life stage deals with, and how some of these issues have also changed over time, and kind of what's causing those changes. So we're actually going to look at it in age order. We're going to start with adolescence. We'll then look at adulthood, and then we'll look at senior citizens and the elderly, which kind of corresponds the most to your documentary. But I want to build up to that in terms of the notes. So today we're just going to look at adolescence. We'll do one in each session. So when we look at adolescence in American society, one of the things that is, I think, most kind of interesting about it is it's really a relatively new idea. So, this question, what distinguishes adolescence from childhood and from adulthood, is an ever evolving question. For a really long time in society, you were a kid, and then you were an adult, and then you passed on. And as time has gone on, what we've seen is childhood has, in a relative sense, stretched. And what I mean by that is, if you think about American history, and all of you have gotten through at least a decent chunk of not just US 1 but US 2, that kids when they were 14, were going out and getting jobs, and were getting married by the time they were 16 and 17 in the colonial era. That child labor was very common in the 19th century and early 20th century. And what we've seen is that society has now started to create rules. And as society has gotten bigger and more complex, we've started to create this kind of new middle life stage, which is adolescence, which, depending on who you ask, ranges anywhere from 10 to 18 up to 12 or 14 to 18. And so that's what we're going to look at, and kind of how and why that has developed. So when we look at adolescence, the big things that have done it are, one, that public education has grown dramatically over the last 100 years. Child labor laws have been passed over the last 100 and roughly 50 years over time. And then in the 20th century in particular, we've seen some real specific separation of adults and children in the justice system. So let's talk about these. Public education of all of the various kind of components is probably the biggest one. That for a very long time in American history, public education was not universal. Certain states would have public education, but the country as a whole did not. And even once we had a national education system, you still weren't necessarily required to go to school, at least in the early period of time. And then from the 1800s forward, we saw the minimum age that you had to complete school go up. So at first, you only had to go to elementary school. Then you only had to go through middle school. And then by the 1930s, we mandated education in the United States until the age of 16. So basically, you had to finish at least your sophomore year of high school. And there's actually some talk about mandating it to 18 at this point. It hasn't been passed, but I would not be surprised if in your lifetime you saw that we had mandatory high school education from the time you enter elementary school through the age of 18. And by now we have the overwhelming majority of Americans graduating high school. And as you see, and I think this is worth noting too, more than half of Americans, 2/3 actually, will either go to college or some sort of training after high school. So as education levels rise, what we've started to see in the US is this desire to kind of widen what is considered adolescence. Another good example here, that's something a little newer is you guys might be aware of this, but health insurance. You can stay on your parents' health insurance until you're 26 now. And that's another example of how we see like the definition of adult, where you're completely independent legally, financially, in all those various ways. It is starting to stretch, and it's not any one specific age anymore. So we'll keep going into that. The second thing that we've seen change is child labor laws. Same type of thing. These, much like education, have staged up. And now, basically, until you are 16, when you're allowed to no longer go to school, you cannot work full time. It is actually illegal for someone to make you work full time. And this links in with the idea that they want you to get an education, but also this recognition in American society that culturally we feel that anybody under the age of 16 should not be working full time because we do not consider them adults in a social sense yet. And then what we also see is in the justice system, there are separation of facilities like juvenile hall versus adult prisons. And there are some exceptions. There have been a couple of very controversial cases where children have been given, very long prison sentences or life in prison. But typically speaking, anybody under the age of 18 is dealt with in a very different legal way. There's no capital punishment typically for minors, though there have been a couple of very unique cases where we saw it applied. You see that whatever you do as a minor, as long as you are convicted as a minor, once you turn 18, your record is sealed and you get a clean slate. There are some exceptions, certain violent crimes. But again, it's this recognition that when you are a child, or at least you are a child in a legal sense, there is a divide. And once you become an adult, you should have like I said, kind of a clean slate legally. So these are all ways that we have developed this kind of middle ground of adolescence. Now, when we look at things that define adolescence in a sociological sense, there are a few things that over time, most societies, not just the United States, have used to kind of carve out this new middle ground between childhood and adulthood. And the first set of things has to do with biological development. These are some of the ones, you've gotten this in health class. Typically when a person enters puberty, that is seen as being a time where they are in adolescence. And when they finish puberty, that is when they have become an adult. That's something that all societies recognize in one form or another. And then there's this thing at the bottom I said called rites, symbolic shifts to adulthood. These aren't as big of a deal in the United States anymore. They tend to be bigger in traditional societies and kind of older cultures. But you still see some elements of rites in American society. I'd say the most common forms of rites in the United States now have to do with things like religion. All right. So that's one of the reasons there's so much variation too. We don't have a specific religion in the U.S. So, for example, things like bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, confirmations, the various ceremonies in different religions that take place when you're in your teenage years. Those are all considered rites because it's not that you're becoming an adult, but in those particular religions or in other cultural traditions, you see that there are kind of symbolic changes. Like a sweet 16 is an example of a rite. We might think of it as a party, but it's actually rooted in this idea of someone starting to become, an adult. So those are all things. And then there's smaller ones too, like when you see things like 8th grade graduation or even high school graduation. While those are a little bit more formal, particularly obviously high school graduation, those types of ceremonies are things that could also be viewed as rites, where they're kind of symbolic acknowledgments that you are becoming more of an adult. Another thing, and it's not necessarily a norm, it's actually more of a condition, is the idea that in adolescence, particularly in developed societies, it's what we would call undefined status. Adolescence gives you certain legal and social and cultural advances where you are treated like an adult. But at the same time, there are significant numbers of things in legal, social, and cultural ways where you are not considered an adult. You're considered a child. And as a result, it leads to a lot of confusion and this idea of an undefined status. So like, let's look at a couple of the various things. When we look at marriage and voting, you could technically get married before you turn 18 if you want. You need to have permission at certain ages, but you can. Yet you're not allowed to vote. Actually, in the 1970s, or up until the 1970s, here's another good example. You could be drafted into the military, but the voting age was actually 21 for a really long time. So you could technically go and fight for the country and get killed without being able to choose your leaders. That's actually the main reason why they lowered the voting age, is that during the Vietnam War, the hypocrisy was brought up that how come I can get drafted at 18, but I can't even vote for the people who are sending me to war until I'm 21. Another one, which I'm sure we're all familiar with 21, the drinking age, right? You are an adult at 18, but you cannot consume an alcoholic beverage until you are 21. Driving is one. At one point you could drive when you were 16 in this country. Then it was 17. Now it's 18 for a full license in most places. So these are all examples of undefined status. Same thing with like the law, right? Under 18, most of the time you are tried as a juvenile. So the penalties are significantly lower. But in some cases you can be tried as an adult, particularly for violent crimes. And then last but not least, and this is the murkiest, is how you're treated by people. I'm sure that it's kind of something that everybody's dealt with at some point in their lives. I'm sure you guys probably deal with this on an almost daily basis, where some adults will treat you like an adult. They'll give you a lot of independence. They'll kind of leave it up to you to fend for yourself. And then other adults will treat you like you are, an elementary school kid or a middle school kid, and they'll constantly be checking in. They will exert authority over you that is unnecessary. And that kind of spectrum of treatment is probably the most common experience that people have in adolescence, because that's one where there aren't really rules. It's social norms, and different people have different kind of definitions or ideas about how people who are adolescents should be treated. You even see that as an adult. Like, adolescence technically ends in a legal sense at 18. But we know that it's something that kind of staggers. I mean, you'll see, when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, you'll still have people who talk to you like you're in middle school. So it's a kind of floating, spectrum in that sense of treatment. And that's another, like I said, thing that kind of contributes to this idea of undefined status. Now, connected with that is there's a gradual kind of ramping up of independence, both socially and legally, when we come to adolescence. So, I mentioned it before, but a good example in the U.S. of a formal version of this is like the graduated driver's license. You get a permit at 16. You get the Cinderella license at 17, where you can't stay out too late and you can't have too many people in the car. And then when you turn 18, you're able to have a full license. That's an example of a formal way that we see increased independence in adolescence. An informal way would be like a curfew, right? The older you get, sometimes parents will let you stay out later on your own. Things like that. So basically the idea that you have more and more control over yourself as you get older and older, but not total control until after adolescence is over. And then kind of, building off of that, and you see that all of these are related. We see that the older people get, and particularly during late adolescence, the rules for social standards and expectations rise. Often there are what are sometimes called push and pull factors, where certain parts of your life as an adolescent will kind of pull you closer to childhood, and other parts of your life will pull you closer to adulthood. We talked about like role and status a couple months ago, and you did your role and status diagrams. A good example would be like the social pressures of maintaining your like friendships and relationships versus like the growing need to like work. If you have a part-time job plus school plus maintaining like relationships, that's an example of this kind of increased societal pressure, because the standards are very different. When people are all, adults and in the working world, there's a different expectation for people getting together because everybody is working full time. When people are children, no one's working, so there's a different expectation. And then in adolescence, you see this kind of spectrum. And so that's a really good example, I think, of when we say societal pressure, what we're talking about. It's not something concrete. And then as we start to kind of wrap up adolescence, we look at what's called the search for self. This has to do with identity. All right. What your roles and statuses are ultimately going to be. You know, we talked about master statuses. What norms will you adhere to? What are the expectations depending on your situation? Your own individual values and how you reconcile them with societal values. You know, career choice, friends, family, all of these things. And they all kind of get lumped together into what a lot of sociologists call the search for self, which is just basically a fancy way of saying the development of your own unique identity. So that's it. Like I said, it was just kind of an intro today. On Monday, what we'll do is we will then look at adulthood. On Tuesday, we will look at late stage adulthood, or sometimes what are called senior citizens and the elderly. And then we'll start to put them together as we work our way into the middle of the week next week. So that's that. As always, shoot me an email if you have any questions, and I will talk to you soon. All right.